The U.S. Supreme Court on Friday agreed to decide whether President Donald Trump's move to end birthright citizenship is legal. It's been a contentious part of his efforts to clamp down on immigration and would change how a 19th century provision of the Constitution has long been understood, that babies born in the United States are guaranteed citizenship. The justices are taking up an appeal by Trump's Justice Department. A ruling from a lower court had blocked Trump's executive order, telling U.S. agencies not to recognize the citizenship of children born in the U.S. if neither parent is an American citizen or legal permanent resident, also called green card holders. The lower court ruled that Trump's policy violated the Constitution's 14th Amendment and a federal law protecting birthright citizenship rights. The case was brought by parents and children whose citizenship is threatened by the directive. The justices are expected to hear arguments during their current term and issue a ruling by the end of June. They did not set a date for the arguments.
Okay, so something absolutely unthinkable just happened at the Supreme Court. And legal experts across the country are saying that America will never be the same after this decision. We're talking about the Supreme Court issuing a ruling that fundamentally strips away core executive powers that presidents have exercised for decades. Powers that Trump was relying on to implement his entire second-term agenda. And the fallout from this decision is so massive, so far-reaching, that Washington, D.C. is literally erupting right now in a combination of celebration, panic, rage, and absolute disbelief. This isn't just a legal setback for Trump. This is a constitutional earthquake that redefines the boundaries of presidential authority, that shifts the balance of power between the three branches of government, and that could render Trump's presidency functionally paralyzed for the remainder of his term. Democrats are treating this like they just won the Super Bowl. Republicans are in complete meltdown mode, trying to figure out how to respond. And constitutional scholars are saying this is one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions in modern American history, comparable to cases like United States v. Nixon or Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. v. Sawyer, that fundamentally reshaped what presidents can and cannot do. The implications of this ruling touch everything: foreign policy, domestic policy, emergency powers, executive orders, federal spending, regulatory authority, and Trump's ability to protect himself from legal accountability. And what makes this even more stunning is that this decision came from a Supreme Court that includes 3 justices appointed by Trump himself. Justices who were supposed to be loyal to him, who were supposed to protect executive power, and who were supposed to give Trump the legal cover he needed to govern without constraints. But they didn't. They joined with the other justices in a decision that has absolutely gutted Trump's ability to function as president in the way he wants to function. But before we dive into the absolute chaos that's unfolding in Washington right now, we need to talk about something really important. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They're either protecting their corporate sponsors or spinning stories to fit a predetermined narrative, and they're leaving out the critical context, the real implications, and the uncomfortable truths about what's happening to American democracy. That's exactly why we built this channel, to bring you real journalism, real analysis, and absolutely no corporate interference. We cut through the political spin and give you the facts that matter, the context that helps you understand what's really going on, and the information that powerful people don't want you to have. If you want to stay ahead of the news cycle and understand the real story behind the biggest political explosions in Washington, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring you the news straight every single day, with complete independence and zero agenda except the truth. Just hit the subscribe button below to join our community of people who refuse to be manipulated by media spin. And if you want to support truly independent journalism that holds the powerful accountable and refuses to bow to political or corporate pressure, this is your moment. Subscribe, turn on notifications so you never miss a breaking story, and drop a comment below telling us what you think about this Supreme Court bombshell that just detonated Trump's presidency. Your voice matters in this conversation, and we want to hear from you. All right, let's get back to the video and break down exactly what the Supreme Court just did, because this is absolutely massive and the implications are staggering. Here's what happened. The Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case that challenged Trump's use of emergency executive powers, specifically his authority to declare national emergencies and then use those declarations to bypass Congress, redirect federal funds, implement policies without legislative approval, and exercise powers that are normally reserved for times of genuine national crisis like war, natural disasters, or imminent threats to national security. The case originated from Trump's attempts to use emergency powers to implement his immigration agenda, to impose tariffs without congressional authorization, to redirect military construction funds to build border barriers, and to take other actions that Congress had either refused to fund or had explicitly prohibited. Trump's legal theory was that the president has broad inherent authority during emergencies, that he gets to define what constitutes an emergency, and that once he declares an emergency, he can exercise extraordinary powers that override normal constitutional limitations and congressional restrictions. It's a theory of executive power that's incredibly expansive, incredibly dangerous, and one that essentially makes the president a temporary dictator whenever he decides there's an emergency. And Trump has been using this theory aggressively throughout his second term, declaring emergencies for situations that most legal experts say don't meet any reasonable definition of a genuine emergency. Multiple parties challenged Trump's emergency declarations in court. Democratic-led states, civil liberties organizations, congressional Democrats, and even some businesses and individuals who were directly harmed by Trump's emergency actions. The cases worked their way through the lower courts with mixed results. Some federal judges ruled against Trump, saying he was abusing emergency powers and exceeding his constitutional authority. Other judges ruled in Trump's favor, saying the president has broad discretion during emergencies, and courts should defer to executive judgment. The conflicting rulings meant the issue had to go to the Supreme Court for final resolution, and everyone knew this was going to be one of the most important cases of the term. Because whatever the Supreme Court decided would either greenlight Trump's emergency powers, essentially giving him a blank check to govern by decree, or it would impose strict limits on presidential emergency authority, forcing Trump to go through Congress and follow normal constitutional processes even when he claims there's an emergency. And the Supreme Court just delivered its decision, and it is absolutely devastating for Trump. In a majority opinion that legal experts are calling surprisingly broad and surprisingly emphatic, the Supreme Court ruled that Trump's use of emergency powers violated the Constitution in multiple ways. The court said that the emergency powers statutes that Trump relied on are unconstitutionally vague, that they grant the president far too much discretion without adequate congressional oversight, and that allowing Trump to exercise these powers the way he has been would fundamentally violate the separation of powers doctrine that's central to American constitutional government. The court went through Trump's specific emergency declarations one by one and found that none of them met the legal standard for a genuine emergency. They said Trump was manufacturing crises, exaggerating threats, and declaring emergencies for purely political purposes in order to bypass Congress and implement policies that Congress had refused to approve. And then the court did something even more dramatic. They didn't just rule against Trump in this specific case. They issued a broad holding that restricts how future presidents can use emergency powers. They said that emergency powers can only be used for genuine, imminent, and extraordinary threats to national security or public safety. They said that economic concerns, immigration policy preferences, trade disputes, and domestic political disagreements do not constitute emergencies that justify bypassing normal constitutional processes. They said that any emergency declaration must be supported by specific factual findings that demonstrate an actual emergency, not just the president's opinion that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And they said that Congress has the authority to terminate any emergency declaration by majority vote, and that courts have the responsibility to review emergency declarations to ensure they're legally justified. The opinion is devastating in its scope and in its language. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion, and he was joined by Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, Jackson, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. That's a 6-3 decision, which means two of Trump's own appointees, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, voted against him. The only dissenters were Justices Thomas, Alito, and Barrett, who argued that the court was overstepping its authority and interfering with the president's constitutional role as chief executive. But they lost, and the majority opinion is now the law of the land. And the language that Roberts used in the opinion is absolutely brutal. He wrote that Trump's use of emergency powers represents a fundamental threat to democratic governance, that it violates the framers' intent to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power, and that allowing this to continue would transform the presidency from a limited executive office into an elected dictatorship. He quoted the Youngstown case from 1952, where the Supreme Court ruled against President Truman for seizing steel mills during the Korean War. And he said that Trump's actions are even more dangerous than what Truman tried to do, because Trump is claiming emergency powers that have no time limit, no congressional check, and no judicial review. Roberts wrote that the Constitution requires that important policy decisions be made by Congress, not by presidential decree, and that emergencies don't suspend the Constitution or eliminate the separation of powers. Now let's talk about what this ruling actually means in practical terms, because the implications are absolutely staggering, and they touch every aspect of Trump's presidency and his ability to govern. First, understand that this decision immediately invalidates multiple emergency declarations that Trump has made since taking office. Trump declared emergencies to justify imposing tariffs on allies and adversaries, to redirect military construction funds to border wall projects, to restrict immigration through executive action, to implement foreign policy initiatives without congressional approval, and to exercise regulatory authority in areas where Congress had refused to give him statutory authorization. All of those emergency declarations are now legally void. They have no force or effect. Any actions Trump took under those emergency authorities are now subject to legal challenge, and in many cases they're going to be reversed or unwound. That means tariffs that Trump imposed might get lifted, border wall construction that was funded through emergency redirections might get halted, immigration restrictions that were implemented through emergency powers might get struck down, and policies that Trump put in place without congressional approval might get eliminated. We're talking about potentially hundreds of executive actions, thousands of regulations and orders, and billions of dollars in spending that are now in legal limbo or completely invalidated. Second, this decision strips Trump of one of his most powerful tools for bypassing Congress and implementing his agenda unilaterally. Throughout his presidency, Trump has relied on emergency declarations as a way to get around congressional opposition. When Congress wouldn't give him money for the border wall, he declared an emergency and redirected military funds. When Congress wouldn't authorize his tariffs, he declared an emergency and imposed them anyway. When Congress wouldn't pass his immigration restrictions, he declared an emergency and implemented them through executive action. That strategy is now dead. The Supreme Court has said clearly that presidents cannot use emergency powers this way, that they have to work with Congress even when Congress disagrees with them, and that declaring fake emergencies to get around legislative opposition is unconstitutional. So going forward, Trump is going to have to actually negotiate with Congress, compromise with Democrats and moderate Republicans, and accept that there are things he wants to do that he simply can't do without congressional approval. For a president like Trump, who views compromise as weakness and who thinks he should be able to govern by decree, this is an absolutely crippling limitation. Third, this decision has massive implications for Trump's foreign policy and his ability to conduct international negotiations. Trump has been using emergency powers to implement trade policies, to impose sanctions, to redirect military aid, and to make commitments to foreign leaders without getting congressional approval. He's declared economic emergencies to justify tariffs on China, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. He's declared national security emergencies to justify weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE without congressional notification. He's used emergency authorities to withhold or redirect foreign aid to Ukraine, to Israel, and to other countries as leverage in negotiations. All of that is now constitutionally suspect. The Supreme Court's ruling suggests that Trump cannot use emergency powers to conduct foreign policy, that he needs congressional authorization for major international commitments, and that courts will scrutinize claims of emergency in the foreign policy context, just as they do in domestic policy. That fundamentally changes how Trump can interact with foreign leaders, because he can no longer promise things or threaten things based on emergency powers that he claims to have. Foreign leaders are going to know that Trump's emergency declarations are legally shaky, that they might get overturned by courts, and that any deals based on those emergency powers might not survive legal challenges. Fourth, and this is absolutely critical, this decision creates a roadmap for challenging every other exercise of executive power that Trump has claimed. Because the Supreme Court didn't just rule narrowly on emergency powers, they issued a broad statement about separation of powers, about congressional authority, and about the limits of what presidents can do without legislative approval. That precedent is going to be used in dozens of other cases challenging Trump's actions. Cases about executive orders on immigration, on environmental regulation, on federal spending, on use of the military, on appointments of officials, on pardons, on assertions of executive privilege. All of those cases are going to cite this Supreme Court decision and argue that Trump is exceeding his constitutional authority. And based on this decision, those challenges have a much better chance of succeeding, because the Supreme Court has sent a clear signal that they're skeptical of broad claims of executive power and that they're willing to impose meaningful limits on what presidents can do. Let's break down what this means for the different power centers in Washington, because the reactions are absolutely explosive and they reveal deep fissures in American politics. Inside the White House, there is reportedly complete chaos. Senior advisors are scrambling to figure out which of Trump's policies are now legally invalid, which actions need to be reversed or modified, and how to salvage Trump's agenda without the emergency powers he's been relying on. Trump himself is said to be absolutely furious, raging at his lawyers for not preventing this decision, attacking the Supreme Court justices who voted against him, and demanding that his staff find ways to work around or ignore the ruling. Sources inside the White House told reporters that Trump is seriously considering just ignoring the Supreme Court decision, declaring that he has inherent authority as president that the courts can't limit, and daring Congress or the courts to try to stop him. That would be an unprecedented constitutional crisis, because it would mean the president is openly defying a Supreme Court ruling. But people close to Trump say he's angry enough and desperate enough that he might actually do it. Trump's legal team is in crisis mode, trying to figure out how to respond to this decision and how to minimize the damage. Some lawyers are advising Trump to comply with the ruling, to work with Congress to get legislative authorization for the things he wants to do, and to avoid escalating this into a constitutional confrontation that he can't win. Other lawyers, the more ideologically driven ones who believe in nearly unlimited executive power, are telling Trump to fight back, to issue new emergency declarations under different legal theories, to challenge the Supreme Court's authority to limit the president, and to take this battle to the American people by arguing that the court is interfering with his ability to protect the country. The internal debate is intense, and it's spilling out into public view through leaks and anonymous quotes to reporters. And while Trump's lawyers argue about strategy, career officials at federal agencies are trying to figure out which regulations and policies they're supposed to be enforcing, which ones are now invalid, and how to operate in this environment of legal uncertainty. Republicans in Congress are absolutely torn about how to respond to this decision. On one hand, many of them are institutionalists who believe in separation of powers and who are relieved that the Supreme Court has reasserted congressional authority over areas like spending, trade policy, and major policy decisions. These are Republicans who have been uncomfortable with Trump's use of emergency powers, who think presidents shouldn't be able to bypass Congress, and who see this decision as a victory for legislative power. Some of them are even publicly praising the decision, saying it restores the proper balance between the branches and prevents the presidency from becoming too powerful. But on the other hand, there are MAGA Republicans who are furious at the Supreme Court, who see this as a betrayal of Trump, and who are demanding that Congress take action to restore Trump's emergency powers through new legislation. These Republicans are attacking the Supreme Court, questioning the legitimacy of the decision, and arguing that the court is part of a deep state conspiracy to undermine Trump's presidency. The split is creating chaos in the Republican caucus, with different factions pulling in opposite directions and with no clear leadership or unified message about how the party should respond. Democrats, meanwhile, are absolutely ecstatic about this decision. They're holding press conferences celebrating it as a victory for democracy, for the rule of law, and for constitutional governance. They're arguing that this decision proves Trump has been governing illegally, that he's been abusing presidential power, and that the courts have finally put him in check. Democratic leaders in the House and Senate are announcing immediate plans to pass legislation that codifies the limits on emergency powers that the Supreme Court outlined, making it even harder for future presidents to abuse emergency declarations. They're also announcing investigations into all of Trump's emergency declarations, demanding documents and testimony about how those decisions were made, whether Trump was advised that they were legally questionable, and what actions were taken under emergency authorities that now need to be reversed. And Democrats are already cutting campaign ads featuring this Supreme Court decision, arguing that it shows Trump is lawless, that he can't be trusted with power, and that voters need to elect Democrats to provide a check on his abuses. Now let's talk about the international reaction to this decision, because America's allies and adversaries are watching this very closely, and they're recalibrating their entire approach to dealing with the United States. Allied governments in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, they've been dealing with Trump for years now, trying to figure out which of his commitments are real, which of his threats are bluffs, and which of his policies are going to last versus which are going to get overturned by courts or reversed by Congress. This Supreme Court decision tells them that a huge portion of Trump's foreign policy has been built on emergency powers that are now constitutionally invalid. That means trade deals Trump negotiated might not be enforceable. Tariffs he imposed might get lifted, military commitments he made might not be honored, and sanctions he threatened might not materialize. Allied leaders are reportedly holding emergency meetings with their own advisors and with American diplomats, trying to understand what this ruling means for existing agreements, for ongoing negotiations, and for the reliability of American commitments. Some allies are relieved because they hated Trump's policies, and they're happy to see them potentially reversed. But others are concerned because they've built their own strategies around accommodating Trump's demands, and now they don't know if those accommodations were even necessary. Adversaries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are looking at this decision and seeing an American president who has been legally neutered, who can't deliver on his threats or his promises, and who is fighting with his own Supreme Court over basic questions of governmental authority. That perception of American weakness and internal dysfunction is incredibly dangerous because it encourages adversaries to test American resolve, to push boundaries, and to take actions they might not take if they thought America had a strong, unified government. Russian officials are already making statements about how this decision shows American democracy is failing and how the American system is too chaotic to be a reliable global leader. Chinese state media is running stories about how the American president can't even control his own government and how China's centralized system is more effective and stable. Iranian leaders are pointing to this as evidence that American threats are hollow because Trump doesn't have the authority to follow through on them. And all of that undermines American credibility, makes it harder for American diplomats to negotiate effectively, and creates opportunities for adversaries to exploit American divisions. Let's also talk about the economic implications of this Supreme Court decision. because markets hate uncertainty, and this decision has injected massive uncertainty into multiple sectors of the American economy. Trump's tariffs, which he imposed using emergency powers, are now legally questionable. That means businesses that have been dealing with those tariffs, that have restructured their supply chains around them, that have raised prices to account for them, they don't know if those tariffs are going to stay in place or suddenly disappear. Companies that do international trade are in limbo, not knowing what the rules are going to be next month or next year. Investors who have made decisions based on Trump's policies are now facing the possibility that those policies might get reversed, which creates risk and volatility. And industries that were affected by Trump's emergency actions, construction companies working on the border wall, defense contractors working on projects funded through emergency redirections, immigration enforcement agencies operating under emergency authorities, all of them are facing potential disruptions to their operations and their revenue streams. Stock markets have already reacted to this decision with significant volatility, with some sectors rallying on the prospect of tariffs being lifted, while other sectors are falling on uncertainty about government policy. And economists are warning that prolonged uncertainty about which policies are in effect and which are going to be reversed could slow economic growth, reduce business investment, and create instability in labor markets. Now, let's talk about what happens next in the legal and political battle over this Supreme Court decision. Because Trump is not going to just accept this ruling and move on. Based on everything we know about Trump's personality and his approach to governance, he's going to fight this with everything he has. First, Trump is likely going to try to find ways to work around the decision. He'll have his lawyers look for other legal authorities he can claim, other statutes he can interpret creatively, and other ways to exercise power without technically violating what the Supreme Court said. He might try to get Congress to pass new emergency powers legislation that addresses the court's concerns, though that's going to be difficult because Democrats control at least one chamber, and they're not going to give Trump broader powers after the court just restricted them. Trump might also try to reframe his emergency declarations, claiming he's not doing what the court prohibited, but something slightly different that's legally distinguishable. That's going to lead to new lawsuits, new court battles, and more years of litigation over the limits of presidential power. Second, Trump is likely going to attack the Supreme Court directly, questioning their legitimacy and trying to delegitimize this decision in the eyes of his supporters. He's already shown a willingness to attack judges who rule against him, calling them politically biased, questioning their motives, and encouraging his supporters to view the judiciary as part of a corrupt establishment. After this decision, we can expect Trump to escalate those attacks, potentially going after the specific justices who voted against him, including his own appointees Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Trump might argue that the Supreme Court has been captured by the deep state, that they're part of a conspiracy to undermine his presidency, and that their rulings don't deserve respect or compliance. That kind of rhetoric is incredibly dangerous because it undermines public confidence in the judiciary. It encourages people to view court decisions as illegitimate political moves rather than legal judgments. And it creates an environment where presidents might feel justified in ignoring court rulings they don't like. Third, this Supreme Court decision is going to energize Trump's political opponents and give them powerful ammunition for the 2026 midterms and the 2024 presidential race. Democrats are going to run on this decision, arguing that Trump tried to become a dictator, that he abused emergency powers to bypass democracy, and that the Supreme Court had to step in to stop him. They're going to use clips from the court's opinion. They're going to highlight the fact that even Trump's own appointees voted against him. And they're going to argue that this proves Trump is unfit for office and dangerous to American democracy. That message is going to resonate with independent voters, with moderate Republicans who are uncomfortable with Trump's authoritarian tendencies, and with anyone who cares about constitutional governance and the rule of law. And it's going to be very hard for Trump and Republicans to counter that message because the facts are clear. Trump abused emergency powers, the Supreme Court ruled against him, and his policies have been invalidated. That's not spin, that's just what happened. Fourth, this decision is going to reshape the 2024 Republican primary if Trump decides to run again, or if other Republicans decide to challenge him. Republican candidates who want to differentiate themselves from Trump now have a clear opening. They can argue that Trump was reckless with executive power, that his abuses led to this Supreme Court rebuke, and that the party needs a leader who respects constitutional limits and can work with Congress instead of trying to govern by decree. Candidates like Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, or others who are positioning themselves as Trump alternatives could use this decision to make the case that Trump has too much baggage, that he's damaged goods, and that Republicans need someone who can win a general election without carrying the burden of Supreme Court decisions declaring their actions unconstitutional. That could fracture Trump's support within the Republican base, especially among voters who care more about winning elections and implementing conservative policies than they do about personal loyalty to Trump. Let's zoom out and talk about what this moment represents in the broader context of American constitutional history. Because what we're witnessing is a fundamental battle over the nature of presidential power and the future of American democracy. The framers of the Constitution designed a system where power would be divided among three branches of government, where each branch would check and balance the others, and where no single person or institution could accumulate enough power to threaten liberty. They were terrified of executive tyranny, having just fought a war against a king who claimed unlimited authority, and they created a presidency with limited, enumerated powers that were subject to legislative and judicial constraints. For most of American history, presidents have generally respected those constraints, even when they chafed against them. But in recent decades, and especially under Trump, we've seen a steady expansion of executive power and a corresponding erosion of congressional and judicial checks. Presidents have claimed broader emergency powers, more expansive interpretations of executive authority, and greater freedom to act without congressional approval. And Trump has taken that expansion to an extreme, claiming that Article 2 of the Constitution gives him the power to do whatever he wants as president. This Supreme Court decision is a pushback against that expansion, a reassertion of constitutional limits, and an attempt to restore the balance of power that the framers intended. But it's also a sign of how fragile that balance has become, because the court had to take the extraordinary step of invalidating major presidential actions and restricting powers that Trump claimed were essential to his ability to govern. The fact that we're at this point, where the Supreme Court has to intervene to stop a president from acting like a dictator, shows how close we are to a constitutional crisis and how much damage has already been done to American democratic institutions. And the question now is whether this decision will be respected and enforced, or whether Trump will defy it and push us into an even deeper crisis where the president openly refuses to comply with Supreme Court rulings. Legal scholars and constitutional experts are already gaming out the scenarios for what happens if Trump defies this ruling. If Trump continues to exercise emergency powers that the court has said are unconstitutional, what can anyone do about it? Congress could impeach him, but we've already seen that impeachment doesn't work when the president's party is loyal to him, regardless of what he does. The courts could hold him in contempt, but how do you enforce a contempt order against the president? You can't arrest him while he's in office, and you can't force him to comply if he simply refuses. The only real enforcement mechanism is political. Voters have to hold him accountable by voting him out of office, and Congress has to hold him accountable by refusing to fund his actions or by using their oversight powers to expose his abuses. But those mechanisms only work if enough people care about constitutional governance and the rule of law to demand accountability. And right now, we're in a political environment where a large portion of the population doesn't trust institutions, doesn't believe in objective truth, and is willing to support Trump no matter what he does because they see him as fighting against a corrupt establishment. So here's the bottom line, and this is the most important thing to understand about this entire situation. The Supreme Court just did something unthinkable. They stripped core executive powers from a sitting president. They ruled that his emergency declarations are unconstitutional. And they fundamentally reshaped the limits of presidential authority in ways that will affect not just Trump, but every future president. Experts are saying America will never be the same after this decision. And they're right, because this ruling represents a turning point in the ongoing battle between executive power and constitutional limits. Trump's presidency has been effectively gutted of one of its most important tools for implementing his agenda. His foreign policy commitments are now questionable. His domestic policies are in legal limbo. His ability to bypass Congress has been eliminated. And his credibility, both at home and abroad, has taken a devastating hit. The fallout from this decision is going to dominate Washington for months, with legal battles over which Trump actions are still valid, political battles over how to respond, and electoral consequences that will reshape the 2026 midterms and the 2024 presidential race. Republicans are divided between those who support the court's defense of constitutional limits and those who see this as a betrayal of Trump. Democrats are energized and weaponizing this decision to argue that Trump is a would-be dictator who had to be stopped by the courts. Allies are confused about what American commitments they can trust. Adversaries are emboldened by the perception of American weakness and dysfunction. And markets are volatile because of the uncertainty about which policies are going to survive and which are going to be reversed. This is a constitutional crisis in slow motion, a fundamental test of whether American institutions can constrain a president who doesn't believe he should be constrained, and a preview of the battles that are going to define American politics for years to come. Watch what Trump does in response to this ruling, whether he complies or defies it. Watch what Congress does, whether they reassert their authority or continue to defer to executive power. Watch what the courts do if Trump tries to work around this decision or ignore it. Watch how voters respond, whether they care about constitutional governance or whether they prioritize other issues. And watch how America's standing in the world changes as allies and adversaries adjust to a United States where the president is fighting with his own Supreme Court over basic questions of governmental power. This story is far from over, and what happens next will determine whether American democracy survives this moment intact or whether we continue sliding toward authoritarianism and constitutional collapse. Keep watching, keep paying attention, and keep demanding accountability, because that's the only way we preserve the system of government that has made America a beacon of democracy for over 2 centuries. This is history unfolding in real time, and the decisions made in the coming weeks and months will echo for generations.